Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, I'm back from Denver, Portland, and Phoenix. Thank you to everyone who came out. Phoenix was a peculiar event, I'm sorry to say. As many of you probably know, there was a BuzzFeed article that came out the day before the Phoenix event that made a wide range of allegations against my co-presenter, Lawrence Krauss, all of which fall into the bin of sexual harassment. And all of us, mutually, in the end, thought it would be better that Lawrence not appear on stage at that event. I'm convinced that was the right decision. But I will reserve further comment about that for my next AMA. I'd rather not do a massive housekeeping here for this episode. I'll record that soon. Questions have been piling up. Someone took some cell phone video of the opening of the Phoenix event, capturing part of my and Matt's opening statement about Lawrence and the Me Too movement and related matters. You should know that's only part of what we said. So whatever's on YouTube is an incomplete record of my thoughts here, but I'll get those out reasonably soon. Okay, this is a podcast that is a little beholden to the news cycle. This is about Trump and the Russia investigation. And this was recorded before the recent indictments of 13 Russians. So things have changed a little bit in the meantime, which seems to further put the lie to the idea that the Russia investigation is a empty witch hunt based purely on a hoax. In any case, I don't think anything has changed too much as to require an addendum from my guest, but this is just a brief, by my podcast standards, 1-hour tour of how a lawyer and former U.S. attorney trained in the relevant areas views the Trump presidency and the Mueller investigation. My guest today is Preet Bharara. Preet is, as I said, a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York from 2009 to 2017. He prosecuted cases involving terrorism, narcotics, arms trafficking, financial and healthcare fraud, cybercrime, public corruption, gang violence, organized crime, civil rights violations. He's been featured by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2017, he joined the faculty of NYU Law School. And he has his own podcast, which is excellent, titled Stay Tuned with Preet. So, fair warning, if you're sick of conversations about Trump and the Russia investigation, this is not the podcast for you, but otherwise it might well be. So now I give you Preet Bharara. I am here with Preet Bharara. Preet, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's just summarize your background because you really have the perfect background for the conversation we're about to have. Please give us your potted bio and just briefly touch on the kinds of areas you have focused on in the law.
Wow. Okay. So we can take up the hour with this. I was born in 1969. So I was born in India, came to the United States. My father is a proud Indian immigrant pediatrician and hoped for his sons to become doctors. We disappointed him deeply. Neither my brother nor I became doctors. Ended up going to law school. After law school, I worked in private practice, although my goal and destination always was really the U.S. Attorney's Office from the time I took a trial practice class, trial advocacy class at Columbia. But it took me a while to get into shape to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I applied, got in after about 6 years in private practice. And while I was a line prosecutor, I prosecuted all sorts of things, as you might imagine, in Manhattan. Narcotics cases, mob cases. Ultimately, I focused more on Russian organized crime, Chinese organized crime, Italian La Cosa Nostra. Did some terrorism cases, not too many. Fraud cases, you name it, we did it. Then I spent 4.5 years working as chief counsel to Senator Schumer on the Judiciary Committee, during which time we had multiple Supreme Court vacancies, and I got to work on judicial confirmation process. And then after Barack Obama became the president, upon the recommendation of the senator, I was nominated to be the U.S. attorney, and then I got to serve in that position for 7.5 years, where we did, again, you name it, except I was overseeing the office instead of being a line person in that office. And what I'm proud of during that tenure is there are some offices I think that are known for focusing on one or two things, and I believe that we didn't disproportionately focus on any one thing. Sometimes some of the stuff we did got disproportionate attention, like insider trading cases, but we worked just as hard on cyber security threats, on gang cases, on securities fraud, on terrorism cases, on public corruption cases, also civil fraud cases. So I think we did a lot of things in a lot of different areas. If you want to talk about them, we can. And I served very humbly and appreciatively in that position until I was fired by Donald Trump last March.
Obviously, your expertise with Russia and Russian organized crime and financial crime is highly relevant to the conversation we'll have here. Say a little bit more about the firing. Was there some point of principle you were standing on in order to be fired? I seem to remember reading that all the U.S. attorneys under President Obama were told to resign and you refused. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's slightly more complicated than that. I had been expecting to leave the office when Donald Trump got elected because that's how it works. But usually, almost in every case, and some people get this wrong, after a period of transition. I got confirmed after Barack Obama became the president in August of 2009, and there was an orderly transition process. People aren't just booted out. Even when Clinton got rid of the holdover U.S. attorneys, that was over a period of time with a built-in transition process. So in any event, I expected to leave a few months after the election, but Donald Trump made the extraordinary move of asking me to stay, which is a little bit of a story, through Senator Schumer. And not only that, invited me to Trump Tower up to the 26th floor, where I met first because Donald Trump was busy with Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner, who kept me company until the president could come and meet. And it was a lovely meeting in which he was very complimentary of how I conducted myself in the position and how the office had done. I made a little speech about independence, and we went on our merry way, with him asking me to stay another term. So fast forward several months, when out of the blue, the president called me for reasons that are still unclear. I thought it was that was on March 9th of 2017. I thought, for various reasons, and after consultation with the Attorney General's office, the Chief of Staff to Jeff Sessions, that it was inappropriate, not knowing the subject matter and knowing how it might look to the public, if there was a conversation, on the side between a sitting president and a sitting U.S. attorney who had jurisdiction over various things, including, him, his associates, his businesses, and a lot of other interests, that unless we knew what it was about, it was the better course to not speak directly with the president. And 20 hours later, I was asked to resign. Now, I don't know if they're connected. I don't know if they're not connected. And so when that happened the first day, so that was on a Friday, not to belabor the story, but I wasn't sure if they meant to include me. So at the beginning, I wasn't thinking to myself, I'm going to be defiant and require being fired. I just wanted to know, given some track record of incompetence and quick decision making on the part of people in the White House, if they had meant to do that. There were two other people who were sitting U.S. attorneys also, who I don't think they meant to ask for their resignations. That was Rod Rosenstein, who was the nominee to be the Deputy Attorney General, and Dana Benta, who was the acting Attorney General at that time. I think, given the haste with which it was done, I was just trying to make sure, as an initial matter, that it meant to include me. And then I consulted with folks in my office, the senior staff, and I've lived long enough to know that you don't know what the reasoning is behind certain things. I had, in my mind, no understanding or explanation as to what may have changed between the time that Donald Trump said, please stay, and orchestrated a fairly high-profile meeting, even before he had named a Secretary of Defense, before he had named a Secretary of State, I believe.
Right.
And I just wanted the record to be clear, for the future, that the person who had personally invited me to come meet with him, shake my hand, look me in the eye, ask me for my phone numbers, that it would be clear from the record that that person also wanted me gone. And it wasn't just sort of some, mass bureaucratic shuffle. And then once I was assured of that, then I left.
Okay, so if someone has been asleep for the last 14 months or just arrived from Mars, I would like to have you walk us through what you think they should understand about our current situation. I guess this is narrowly focused on the Russia investigation and what seems to be our kind of the most plausible picture of what has happened there and what is happening to uncover more of the facts and the president's behavior through this whole time with respect to the investigation. Can you just start a kind of a narrative as to what has been going on and where we think we are now and where you think this is all going?
Sure. So I think if the alien had a deep understanding of what American history had been like, I think the alien would think to himself, herself, or itself, things seem a little bit different. You have a president of the United States who has a different background from anyone else who's been elected, which is not necessarily a terrible thing. A person, the first time in maybe forever, I can't remember if this is true, but with no political experience, no public service experience, and no military experience of any kind, which is a first, which can be a
Yeah.
good thing, which can be, precedents were made to be broken and the status quo is meant to be disrupted. And that can be a tremendous thing. It's important in technology, it's important in science, it can be important in government as well. But you don't want to throw out the things that are good and the things that make, the country strong and the institutions that got us to where we are. So I think, if you're looking at it from the outside, you're thinking to yourself, how did we get to a point where a president is trashing the press, is calling one of the great, I think, protectors of democracy and freedom, even though they get it wrong sometimes. The press is made up of human beings like any other institution is, but calling the press the enemy of the state, we've fallen a little bit far if that's the current state of affairs. How you have a president who can't say a bad word about certain kinds of people, including authoritarians like Putin and Duterte and Erdogan, while at the same time, if anyone in the United States, has the temerity to engage in some kind of protest that he doesn't agree with, he slams them by name, he punches down, he bullies people. Uh, he doesn't like how judges operate. You get the sense, if you're observing from the outside, that thank God the framers had certain structural protections in place, and the places where the Constitution has structural protection, I think we're okay. Uh, if the president doesn't like a judge's ruling, the most he can do at this point is holler about it, yell about it, vent about it, tweet about it, or do all of those things. And the judge, has in the federal system has life tenure and may not like it and may not like, being named publicly, and it may be difficult to get the hate mail, but can just continue to do his or her duty under the Constitution. And that's because the framers made that possible. I think the same is true with the institution of the press. You can complain about it, you can call it fake news, you can denigrate it, you can undermine it. But at the end of the day, notwithstanding some silly talk about wanting to revamp the libel laws and expressing concern about the First Amendment is pretty much here to stay as well. Where I worry about the state of affairs over the last 14 months is the president, where he has the ability not to, follow tradition, where there are no hard laws, there are no constitutional provisions. He can get away with a lot of things. And we have come to expect presidents to behave a certain way, to release their tax returns when they run for office so that there's transparency, to divest their economic interests so there's no conflicts of interest, not to surround himself with people who are not even able to get a security clearance after 13 or 14 months, to have, unpaid around him, his daughter, his son-in-law. There's a whole variety of things that are bad, not because they are different necessarily from how prior presidents have done things, but because they undermine, I think, people's faith in democracy and undermine what I think makes us strong. And when you talk about the particulars of the Russia investigation, which I don't have any personal knowledge of, it's being conducted by Bob Mueller and a team of people who I know personally to some degree. The idea that there has been meddling in the election by by the Russians, and the president doesn't seem to care, doesn't seem to want to talk about it, and more importantly, doesn't seem to want to do anything about it, in part because it maybe undermines, in his mind, the legitimacy of the last election, I think is an abomination, and it's not good for the country, and it puts in question the president's slogan that he loves to utter, which is very simplistic and could resonate if it were true and backed up by action: America first. So, that's sort of how I'm thinking about how things are going on.
You raise a few points here which, on their face, should be astounding to people or to anyone who's thinking about this through an unbiased lens. Partisanship aside, it is astonishing to have a president who is attacking our bipartisan institutions from an apparently personally defensive and, quite frankly, often unhinged place.
And maybe nihilistic even too.
Yeah, so he's attacking the press as the enemy of the people. He's attacking individuals on Twitter, private citizens he's singling out for abuse. He's attacking the Department of Justice, the FBI, all of our intelligence agencies upon which he has to rely to get any information about what's actually going on in the world. And as you say, what he hasn't done is say a single negative word about dictators whose reputations precede them by now decades, someone like Putin. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
there's no way to not criticize Putin as an autocrat if you're actually speaking about what's happening in the
Yeah, I
world.
mean, he likes autocrats. I think he wishes he could be one. I mean, the question of some relevance is, we were talking about the Constitution and the checks and balances and the structure of the various branches of government, which are bulwarks against this kind of thing. But it's an interesting question to ask. If Donald Trump had his druthers, right, and he doesn't, but if he had his druthers and he did not have limitation, is there something in his own mind, body, soul, intellect, moral compass that would prevent him from doing various things? In other words, if he had his druthers, would he put journalists in jail who didn't like? If he had his druthers, would he completely revamp the libel law to make him able to sue anyone who criticized him? If he had his druthers, what kind of a police state would he think would be okay? If he had his druthers, how independent do you think he would allow the Justice Department to be? He's, restrained and curtailed in that respect in a lot of ways. But I don't know if there has been a president, and people point to Nixon, but I don't really know, who, if given, unrestricted authority, ability, power, would be capable of doing what I believe is in Donald Trump's heart and mind to do. And part of that is evidenced by, as we've been discussing, his apparent, affection for not necessarily the people themselves, although maybe he has personal affection for Putin and others, but he seems to be enamored of what they are able to do and how strong they are able to be and how unchallenged
Yeah.
and unchecked they can go about their business. And I think he loves that. And I think if there's any way possible he could be that way, he would. I think he is unpatriotic in the sense that not only does he undermine the institutions, he doesn't have respect for them, and he wishes. And I don't hear people asking him this, like, in this way, and I'm sure he would, evade and deflect. But I don't think he has respect for the institutions that check the president because he doesn't want to be checked.
As you say, it's even worse than that because he doesn't even care that the people he's praising, in this case Putin, are adversaries
Right.
of the United States. We're dealing with in the main, a hostile foreign power that has targeted our democracy in ways that are now well established. And obviously, this is believed to be a mere conspiracy theory by many of Trump's defenders. But the fact that there seems to be no doubt that Russia does this, not just to the United States, but to basically every democracy that it cares to pay attention to. And it's just amazing that given all the evidence of their meddling and given the continuous problem of cyber attacks that emanate not just from Russia, but other countries like North Korea and China, the fact that he has shown no willingness to get to the bottom of this and to defend us against our obvious adversaries and is rather joining the people who are claiming that this is all a conspiracy theory, apart from the fact that it signals that he has something to hide, it is just a nearly treasonous level of unconcern as president. It's just, I've
Sam,
never heard a defense of
Sam,
that.
look, I think treasonous is a word that's only reserved for Democrats who don't clap for him during the State of the Union.
That's right. Yeah.
Look,
No, I realize it's a big word to, even in this context, to get a lawyer to sign off
but
on.
I think, I think there are a couple of other things going on. So I don't know if the reason that he's so supine on these issues relating to Russian meddling is because he has something to hide. If as some people love to speculate, that Putin has a lovely file on him, and he's beholden, and Trump is beholden to Putin. But there's something else that's going on. Without having to resort to conspiracy theory, we know something else about the president. I'm not trying to play armchair psychology. He has a lot of power, and he's incredibly insecure. And the combination of tremendous power, which he sort of walked into accidentally, combined with tremendous insecurity, not only about sort of his wealth, but about a lot of other things, including the legitimacy of having won the of his election victory, combines to create a dynamic in which anything relating to Russia and anything relating to the future, which is not a partisan issue, he doesn't like to talk about, he doesn't like to reflect on, he doesn't like to lead on, because it threatens to throw into the air again this question about what happened in 2016. And did he get elected on his own, or did he have aid from this other country? And I think his insecurity causes him to hate that so much that it blinds him to the other responsibilities that he has as a president of the entire country and someone who's supposed to be the guarantor of free and fair elections for both parties.
Yeah, although if it was just a matter of his insecurity and the perception of the legitimacy of the election, and there was no collusion or no way in which he was beholden to Russia, for, financial arrangements that predate his campaign by probably decades, I don't know why he wouldn't just go on offense and say the things you would expect an innocent person who was outraged by Russian meddling and Putin's own history as an autocrat would say. This is completely unacceptable. If there was any meddling, obviously I don't think it accounts for my winning the election, but it's completely unacceptable, and we will get to the bottom of it. And Putin is somebody who has to straighten out. He's not a Democrat. He kills journalists. This is all well established. And we have to deal with him, but he doesn't appear to be any friend to the United States. What would prevent him from saying those obviously sane things if he were just concerned about the public's perception?
Yeah, look, I don't disagree with you. I think multiple things can be going on at once. We often say when we're investigating cases, and this can be said of the White House and certain things that they were doing, nefariousness and incompetence are not mutually exclusive. So insecurity and and misconduct are not mutually exclusive either. And in his case, at least the way we're talking about it, they both, sort of suggest acting in the same direction, right? That they're not in conflict with as far as he's concerned. I think he likes the autocratic power those folks have. He may have something to hide because he's acting like it. And he also doesn't like the way it makes him feel because he's insecure. All those three factors lead to the same kind of conduct. And by the way, it also doesn't necessarily explain, his affection for and compliments of, these other strong arm folks with whom we don't have the same antagonistic relationship with respect to the election, like Erdogan and like Duterte. I mean, Duterte in particular, given the kind of work that I have done and used to do, the way that Duterte talks about fighting the war against drugs and the extrajudicial killings that not only have happened, but that Duterte brags about and claims that he's personally killed people or thrown people from helicopters and engaged in all sorts of violence as a populist hero trying to eradicate drugs from that country. I don't think Trump has specifically advocated any of those particular things, but he speaks in general terms about the great job that Duterte has done. And, I don't believe the Philippines meddled in our election. So there is this other thing going on, this effect for people who have that kind of power because maybe he aspires to it.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, the other thing we haven't talked about, going back to our alien coming from Mars, that I think imbues all of this with something terrible, separate and apart from the attacks on institutions and, something he may be hiding and everything else. This is a person who does not believe in speaking the truth in any context and virtually at any moment. And that is something that is more dangerous than a lot of other things. Casting not just aspersions on people who he disagrees with, but casting doubt on all truth, and literally without compunction, tweeting out things that are demonstrably wrong and false on a regular basis, and then you're you're treated to this vision of tens of millions of people not caring about that and agreeing with him regardless, and manufacturing counter theories and counter conspiracy theories. That's in some people's minds, I think, the worst thing that's going on, because he has a lot of power and is using the bully pulpit in a particular way that no one has used it before, but in favor of disbelief in anything you hear. Just because you saw it with your own eyes doesn't mean you have to believe it. And people are starting to subscribe to that. I had I have a podcast too. It's not been around as long as yours. And I had Gary
Yeah, no,
Kasparov on.
it's a great one. Yeah.
Thank you. But Gary Kasparov was on, who's no, friend of Putin's, and he said something interesting. The idea behind being a certain kind of autocrat like Putin, and Trump seems to emulate some of this, is not to say that this other person is always wrong. Is not to say that this other news outlet is always incorrect, and not to have every single outlet, lionize you and say everything you do is great. It's to cause people to not know what is true and what is not true. It's to sow confusion about what the truth is. So if somebody says, this person was fired for this reason, or somebody says, this ruling is okay or not okay, Donald Trump can cast enough doubt about it that people have to wonder, are we getting the truth from anywhere? I mean, he flips on a regular, there was a time when he said Fox News was terrible because they weren't saying good things about him. And then he says Fox News is great. There are times when he says, the New York Times is terrible, the failing New York Times. Then they say something positive, and then he calls them up and he sits for an interview and he says that they're terrific. He cites sources that he hates when they support him or support a proposition that he espouses, and then he does the opposite. And so it's kind of a confusing merry-go-round of truth, untruth that upends people's understanding and I think confidence in every outlet.
Yeah, well, that's where we are. We're in this place where our epistemology has broken down and everyone is now siloed in their echo chamber, and you have people who are taking InfoWars as a legitimate organ of the news, apparently with a totally clear conscience, right? And if even if they would bracket that with some question as to the veracity of everything they get there, they certainly would compare it favorably with any legitimate organ of the news, whether it's the New York Times or the Economist or the Atlantic. And so that already is a fairly terrifying
Right.
destabilization of our public conversation. It's one that we should remind people has been explicitly endorsed by the president. I mean, the president sat down with Alex Jones and praised him as basically the new Walter
Yeah, well,
Cronkite.
that kills me the most. I mean, one of the things that kills me the most in all this is that I don't know that there's a more odious outlet figure than Alex Jones, and every time there is a tragic massacre of children, like we just saw this week when we're taping in Florida, one's mind sometimes goes to Alex Jones, who put the families of people who suffered loss and death and grief
Unbelievable.
in
Yeah.
Sandy Hook. That you can have a president of the United States say about that person, you're terrific and you're great, and sit down with him for an interview, and at the same time say that some other outlet like the New York Times, which they make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I make mistakes. I'm sure you don't make any mistakes, but we all make a few. And to basically, to his constituency, suggest not only that you can equate Alex Jones's disgusting reporting and nonsense and made up garbage with the New York Times, but that the first is superior to the second in some ways. And when people follow, there's some, maybe this is a quaint thought, but when people have power, they have responsibility to something other than themselves, other than to their own self-aggrandizement. And Donald Trump has a lot of power because there are a lot of disaffected people who believe in him and hated the status quo, and it is what it is. He has the ability to take them to bad places, and he doesn't need to do it. I mean, maybe he does need to do it to maintain, the standing that he has in the 30s as far as approval ratings go. But it seems that he takes it farther than other politicians, even fairly odious politicians, have taken it.
What do you make of the fact that so few people seem to care about his lies? Because I would agree with you. I'm
I
certainly
care.
one of
Don't
those
you
people
care?
who,
We care.
well, yeah, no, but the fact that it doesn't cost him, I mean, how is it that someone like Paul Ryan can not repudiate this behavior? I mean, how is his political opportunism?
I think you've answered. I think that's what it is.
I can answer
Yeah,
my
I think
own
it's- I
question
think
here that
The answer is
his poll results are dependent upon him passing this loyalty test. It really is a kind of prolonged loyalty test. If the king is telling lies, however transparently false they are, you are signaling your loyalty by just falling into step behind them, or even publicly trying to make sense of the lies in a way that is supportive of them. I mean, basically acting like his deranged press secretary. it has the makings of a kind of personality cult. I mean, I guess it's enforced not so much by love of the dear leader, but by a fear of your sinking poll results if you demur on anything. But it's just astonishing to see people who have real reputations and real careers and some semblance of probity in their lives, or have, heretofore had some semblance of, and yet they are covering for a kind of moral lunatic. Certainly with respect to this variable, the variable of an assault on the truth, a sustained assault on the truth.
I think it's not a coincidence that the people who are saying things that sound like they're standing up to the president and standing up for principle over party or country over party are the people who have decided we're not running again. Because to choose to run for office and to remain viable, I guess you're supposed to um, engage in this calculation you're talking about, and understand the nature and vagaries of political opportunism, and decide, if I go at the president now, then I won't be able to remain in office because he can turn on, turn the big bazookas, political bazooka guns on me. And I think Paul Ryan does that calculation over and over again. Look, you got a person like Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, who, separate and apart from political calculation, you would think if you just had some kind of self-respect and
Yeah.
dignity as a human being, and this odious person who you said is odious and who you ran against, and who says basically to Ted Cruz, "Your wife is ugly, and your dad
And your
your
dad
dad killed
killed Kennedy.
Kennedy," and you say in the moment in your macho spirit, uh, I'm a tough Texan, Republican, hard guy, and you say to the president, I forgot what he said exactly, but he wagged his finger and he said things that sounded appropriately strong, and stood up for his wife and his late father. And then 5 minutes later, when the political calculation changes, he's Trump's buddy, and that's, to
Yeah.
me, that's in some ways worse than what Paul Ryan is doing. But then on the other hand, just to go through the continuum, you have someone like Jeff Flake, and I had Jeff Flake on my program. And on the one hand, you say, well, Jeff Flake decided he's not running for office, so it doesn't, maybe it doesn't take as much courage to stand up to the president and go to the floor of the Senate and say a bunch of things. And then, the people who don't already like the president don't all rally to Jeff Flake's defense, and don't all want to lift him up on their shoulders. What you hear a lot of liberals say who don't like the president is that talk is cheap. And what Jeff Flake is saying is, is nice. There's some nice alliteration in his speeches, but he still votes with the president, 85% of the time or 90% of the time, and he's getting out of the fight. And that's nothing to laud. I don't agree with those people. I think, given how devastating Donald Trump has been and could be to various institutions that we care about that are not related to party, that we should welcome any voice that decides to depart from, the narrow-minded, blindered Paul Ryan, Ted Cruz enabling of the president. And if you have a person like Jeff Flake, and I understand the limits, and I think there's some people who think, well, they're only going to appreciate Jeff Flake if he all of a sudden sprouts wings and becomes, an actual liberal Democrat and changes his
Right.
views on all sorts of things. That's not going to happen. But I think, given that we're talking about things that are not just about, tax policy or, the size of government, but you're talking about things like decency, integrity, the separation of powers, the independence of law enforcement, um, the importance of the free press. Those are things that people on both sides of the aisle should care about. And any voice that acknowledges that and that supports those principles and ideals from within the party that Trump purports to belong to, I think we should welcome.
Yeah, no, I totally agree there. And I think the most credible criticism of the president has come from, the center right Republicans, the never Trumpers, the David
Yes.
Frums of the world, the Charles Murrays, because you can't allege any partisanship in that case. It's just a conversation about institutions and the importance of a fact-based discussion and conflicts of
Yeah.
interest and all the
Yeah.
rest. I want to talk for a moment about, I know you're not part of the Mueller investigation, but this is the sort of job you have done for many years, and you have this expertise in financial crime and Russian meddling in other societies. If you had to guess, what do you think is true of Trump's connection to Russia financially? I mean, what do you think his tax returns
Well,
would have shown?
like the other thing that is true of me, given the prior job I had, not only did I work on issues relating to Russian organized crime and money laundering and financial fraud, but I also developed a habit born of that work of not speculating too much because it's impossible to know. And look, I ask these same questions, and when I do my side job as a legal analyst on CNN, I get asked these questions, and I'm kind of loath to speculate too much. It seems to be the case, based on what you said, that you can draw an inference that he has some financial interest in Russia that may not have been fully disclosed. There were a lot of meetings, there were a lot of connections. I think I think one of the sons bragged at one point things that they had in Russia.
Yeah,
The same is true in Turkey, but it's a slightly different
yeah.
context. Uh, and where there's a lot of uh, business, and where you have people who don't always cross all the T's and dot all the I's, and people who don't lead with a great tone from the top, as we're seeing Donald Trump doing as president of the United States, and a culture that's being created in which cabinet secretaries decide to take private planes to go 90 miles to Philadelphia from Washington, and another decides to go first class because he doesn't like to mingle with regular people in coach. All sorts of minor seeming ethical lapses occurring because a particular culture has been created. And again, just continuing on the speculation.
Well, you can also add to that these crazy stories about how much self-enrichment has been going on in terms of the Secret Service paying rent in
Yes.
Trump Tower and the cost of traveling to Mar-a-Lago. He's basically spent Obama's 2 terms of security budget in something like 2 months. This is ostensibly a billionaire who is extracting money from from the government for his own businesses, seemingly at every opportunity.
Yeah. And when, and experience teaches you, and history teaches, that when you have organizations that are run in a particular way, and where the leadership uh, creates a particular kind of culture that really doesn't care much about doing things by the book or the right way, uh, and likes to engage in lack of transparency, that's a place where prosecutors like to look, because it is often the case that that's where people do bad things. And when you're put under a microscope, things can be found. And I think, speculating just a little bit, that the Mueller investigation is probably looking at all manner of financial issues and dealings that came across their radar screen that we don't know about. And they're complicated and they're difficult. And part of the reason we don't know about them is because they've been hidden from the public. And I don't have no personal knowledge. I'm not in communication with anybody on the team, even though several of them are personal friends of mine, and nor will I have contact with them. But just from the hints you get, and the way that investigations operate, and given the vast network of dealings and transactions and interdependency involving multiple countries and lots of different companies, I would not be surprised at all if there was impropriety that crossed the line into criminal conduct that may be unearthed.
Is there any reason to think that the totality of Trump's financial dealings is not part of, or that any part of it is excluded from the investigation, or can Mueller look into anything as a matter of his kind of legal permission?
I mean, he's got a fairly broad mandate, but here's what people I think don't always understand, and there are critics of Mueller who say he's gone beyond the Russia investigation. But this is how it works. If we put it, taken out of the context of the special counsel investigation and prosecution, if a prosecutor decides to take a look at a reputed mobster, or starts to take a look based on credible reports and whistleblowing that a particular CEO of a company is engaged in some kind of bad conduct, is cooking the books, is ordering the CFO to cook the books in a particular way, then what happens? You start to look at that issue, and you start to interview people when you become overt. But before that, you subpoena bank records, you look at phone records, and interesting things come across the radar screen when you do that. And you don't look away. In the same, this the simplest way to describe it, as people get taught in law school. If you have a search warrant to go into someone's home that's authorized by a court to look for, a gun, because you think there's an unlawfully possessed gun in the home, and you come into the kitchen and you see a kilo of cocaine on the table, you can arrest the guy for the kilo of cocaine. And there's a lot of plain view stuff that could be happening in the Mueller investigation. When you're looking at everything, and then you can't turn a blind eye to that. It doesn't mean that they're on all sorts of detours and frolics and they're running far afield. But when it comes in front of you, you have to take a look. And a lot of investigations that we did when I was the United States Attorney took various twists and turns because you started to realize, well, maybe this thing that we happen to be looking at will not bear fruit. And it's not like we're trying to find something so that we can justify the fact that we opened up an investigation. But in the course of looking at A, we found out discovered evidence of B. And then you pursue B. And that's the problem with lots of companies and individuals who engage in shady business. And I say this when I talk to folks, on Wall Street and others, about how they should think about conducting themselves. It may not be that you're committing a crime, but if you're doing things that cause suspicion, people are going to take a look at you. I mean, it's like when the IRS, nobody likes to be audited by the IRS, but if you do something that raises a red flag and the IRS comes and takes a look, it may be that red flag was false. But now that they're looking, you better hope that everything else is done in a kosher way.
What do you think of the public-facing dramatic events that we've noticed, like, the indictment of Flynn and his pleading guilty to some charge, lying to the FBI, and the Papadopoulos as well? What have been the moments that you think are giving Trump the biggest headache, and what do you think they portend? I know I'm asking you to speculate into this black box, but what can you speculate about?
The one you haven't mentioned is the firing of Jim Comey, and I think that was a highly significant inflection point in the whole thing. We can come back to that in a second. On the Flynn plea, a lot of people have been saying and have said that the fact that he pled guilty to a fairly minor offense, although I don't think, a false statement to law enforcement is a minor offense, a violation of 18 U.S.C. 1001, and that's all he pled guilty to, is in the minds of some armchair prosecutors a signal that he must have tremendously significant incriminating evidence against, Trump, Jared Kushner, you name it, because otherwise he wouldn't have been let off so light. And I actually recorded a special podcast on this because I tended to disagree with those people who were so sure that that's what it means. And what I think is it could mean one of a number of things. It could mean, and this doesn't make the people who don't like Trump happy, it could mean that at the end of the day, notwithstanding all this reporting of Michael Flynn doing weird things at the behest of the Turkish government and not registering properly and having to do that retroactively, that's all he thought, all Mueller thought was appropriate to charge Flynn with. And for various reasons, technical, legal, factual, ethical, they thought, that's it. And that's the end of the case against Flynn. I think that's one possibility, and one that even the people who don't like Donald Trump or don't like Michael Flynn have to contend with. The other possibility is, I guess, what people have suggested, that he got a sweetheart deal, and this must mean he's going to do all these things, all this testifying in the future. I don't know that I buy that. I think that at some point in the future, if Flynn's testimony is going to be used in a significant way to charge another person higher up in the food chain, an associate or relative of Donald Trump, or as part of a referral of Donald Trump to the House of Representatives himself, then if Michael Flynn was a participant in that conduct, in that misconduct, Michael Flynn will be required to plead guilty to those things, because that's just how the way good prosecutors do it. It's better tactically and strategically, so it doesn't look like the witness you're going to put on the stand, who is now, by the way, an admitted convicted liar under 18 U.S.C. 1001, it also makes that person look like they're accepting some responsibility for the conduct that he's trying to point the finger at with respect to other people. So, I don't know if that's all they got. I don't think it was a sweetheart deal that's concluded. It's also possible, and this is highly unusual, and people think, maybe I don't make a lot of sense when I suggest this possibility, but it may be that, the Mueller team is holding in abeyance this idea. So if it's true that Michael Flynn has substantial evidence and can testify in an effective and helpful way against some other person that Bob Mueller is going to charge, then maybe at that time there will be another proceeding where Michael Flynn will have to accept other responsibility, or it may be that this gets complicated, right? That the decision tree does, that the Mueller team is not sure yet. Based on the evidence that has been given to them by Michael Flynn, they're not sure if any other human is going to be charged. They don't know if they have enough. They don't know if they find Michael Flynn to be a good enough witness. And in that circumstance, because this is speculation, in that circumstance, given the nature of this case and the extraordinary stakes, that at the center of all this is a sitting, duly elected president of the United States, the idea that on spec, you're going to give a certain kind of deal to Michael Flynn and have him plead guilty in a way that raises expectations as to further charges against other high-ranking people in the White House, that maybe is a bridge too far. And maybe they want to wait to cross that bridge until they come to it. Again, that's a spun out theory, just based on my experiences and having a sense of how you might want to have this unfold in a way that's both fair, just, effective, and preserving of people's faith and confidence in the process. But I think that's a possibility.
It doesn't close the door to any future sweetheart deal, right? I mean,
Correct.
right.
Sure. I mean, I think what people find unusual is part of the problem with speculation on everything having to do with the Mueller investigation is that it's not a garden variety case. And so when people like me, I think I have a lot of experience. Now, listeners need to take everything that people like me and others say with a grain of salt, because I never investigated a president. And nobody else is talking every day. They have these people who come from the era of Watergate, and maybe they have a little bit more sort of perspective on what they're talking about. But no one has ever done an investigation like this, ever. There's never been anything like this. And, I do think that, a case is a case. No one's above the law. You follow all the rules. There are certain T's you cross, I's you dot. When you get a search warrant, when you surveil someone, when you get a, wiretap authorization, all of that is true. I do think, however, when you're talking about the rare circumstance of investigating the leader of the country, who, by the way, the consensus of opinion is that person cannot be indicted criminally while sitting in office, that it may be that I and others who are pundits who come on podcasts and go on TV don't know everything that they're talking about, and that there are considerations that the Mueller team, in good faith and in consonance with what America is supposed to be about and what the law is supposed to be about, are taking into account things that are causing them to do things differently from how a garden variety United States attorney might in some random money laundering case in their district. That's just a caution I would give people.
Right. Who else did you want to talk about here? I know you wanted to talk about the firing of Comey, but is Manafort relevant? And
Yeah, he can be. I mean, I say the same, about, we'll see what Manafort does. There's speculation, that he has some things to say. One can never know. There are two kinds of cooperators, right? They're the ones who, when you approach them, they sort of faint and cave immediately, and they can be used proactively to develop evidence when nobody knows they're a cooperator, and we've used that a lot of times. And then there are some people who say, you know what, I'm not going to cooperate with you. They get approached, and they say, go to hell, get away from me, and then you charge them. And then as the days go by and the clock ticks, they realize they're in more of a jam than they appreciated, and they cooperate then, and then they can provide historical information. So who knows what's going to happen with Paul Manafort? The reason I mentioned the Comey firing is in some ways that's sort of like the big bang that created the universe that we're in, right? And it also portends other things, right? So when you and others ask the question, what's going to happen here? Well, the ball is not only, there are multiple balls here and there are multiple courts. So Bob Mueller has his mandate, and he's proceeding apace and fairly swiftly based on everything that I can see from an outside perspective. But Donald Trump has some things he can do too. And the two things he did tell you that nothing is off the table. One, he actually fired Jim Comey. I was astonished that happened, because we know in retrospect that his political ace strategist, who's now on the outs, Steve Bannon, argued vehemently against it, said it was the dumbest political move I think he's seen in modern times. And a lot of people must have been arguing against it. And Donald Trump is not a stupid person, notwithstanding how everyone wants to infantilize him. He's smart, but he also becomes enraged, and he also has these insecurities, and he fired him anyway. The second thing he did was he flew in the face of all sorts of precedent and process, and I think good practice, by pardoning Joe Arpaio. So he has now fired somebody of tremendous prominence who was a thorn in his side, and he has pardoned somebody who was his ally, but who is a fairly villainous person to, I think, the majority of Americans. Why is that significant going forward? It's significant going forward because Bob Mueller and Rod Rosenstein remain, I think, vulnerable to being fired because Donald Trump at some point doesn't care. And people like Michael Flynn and others, I think, remain subject to being pardoned. And all of those things can happen. And so when people say, it's a bridge too far, he would never do it, people are safe. The number of stories we have now heard about moments where Donald Trump wanted to fire Rod Rosenstein or Jeff Sessions or other people is kind of astounding. And I bet we don't even know all the stories because maybe not everybody is leaking 10 times a day like some of them are. That means that Donald Trump, when cornered or when he thinks he's in trouble or when he becomes enraged about issues relating to the Russia investigation, I think is actually capable of anything. So when we try to predict what's going to happen in the future, we need to think about what Bob Mueller is doing with his head down quietly, but also the moves that Donald Trump can engage in.
What do you think would happen if he did just that? He fires Bob Mueller on a Tuesday and pardons Flynn on a Wednesday. What happens on Thursday?
A very long podcast by me. Look, there's a lot of talk, right? And I think we can predict two things. On the Democratic side, a universe of people who don't like Trump to begin with and were opposed to him to begin with will say, take to the streets. And I think it'll be a big problem. I think there'll be a huge uproar and people will utter without knowing the meaning of it. This is a constitutional crisis and there'll be a lot of signs in the street. And I think that would be appropriate if he engages in that kind of activity. But the real question is going to be, what conduct are we going to see from the people that you and I were speaking about earlier, the Paul Ryans of the world and the Ted Cruzes of the world? Now, some of those people talk a decent game and have said things about Bob Mueller that are positive and say, he should continue his investigation. Lindsey Graham has said things like that as well. But when push comes to shove, if he fires Bob Mueller and his approval ratings don't tank further, I worry that maybe there are people on the other side of the aisle, even though I think this is not a partisan issue, and does deal a very substantial blow to the rule of law, very substantial blow to the rule of law, that some people will go along with it. I mean, I worry about that.
If he fired Bob Mueller, the investigation goes away, or Mueller's subordinate is now running the investigation?
Well, so that's an interesting question. I think if someone fires Mueller, then Mueller has the authority. There was not a team that was appointed. It was Mueller who was given the authorization to conduct this investigation. And I think if you cut off the head, then the body goes too. But then there are two other possibilities, and this is where I think, further answer to your earlier question, where I think congressional courage and spine will matter, because Congress could go right into session and enact some statute on a veto-proof majority that creates essentially what we got rid of some time ago, some version of an independent counsel, and I think can name Bob Mueller to it. And then the president, if it's a veto-proof majority, would have no choice but to now have a further emboldened, more prosecutor and a more polarized country, and someone who has more reason to believe that Donald Trump had something to hide. I don't know if that will happen. I have no idea if that will happen. One of the other things is, it'll be a big dramatic show. But it does look like, I think from a lot of people's perspectives, that the Democrats will take back the House. And then they have a very substantial responsibility to figure out what they're going to do. And there are people in the House right now, and there are conservatives right now who think that based on what is publicly known about Donald Trump's conduct, that he should be impeached. There are also people who are, political in nature, who think he should be impeached, but don't think the Democrats should be talking about it. Don't think they should be pursuing it because they worry about what happened, back in 1998 and 1999. Then there was overreaching by the Republican House. So the problem with all of this is, from at least my perspective, is a lot of what's going to happen is going to depend on politics, is going to depend on, personal power calculations, is going to depend on people's putting their fingers in the wind. When, the way I was brought up and learned how to deal with issues of criminality and transgressions of the law is doing it in a fully apolitical way. But the system we have allows for that kind of a process, and maybe the founders were very smart in this, that if you have potential criminal conduct by the president of the United States, because it's such a high position, it should be dealt with in a political forum. And God knows how that's going to be handled. And if it's going to be handled in a way that is angry and overreaching, or if it's going to be handled in a way that's sort of sober, sad, responsible, and bipartisan. I just don't know. I mean, what's your guess?
Again, I'm so far outside the inside here in terms of understanding the politics. I'm continually astonished at the lack of scruple and principle you see from Republicans who are falling into line behind him, no matter how ugly his behavior. And it's just, the whole thing is truly mystifying to me. I just don't because we're dealing with a situation where Trump is advertised as one of the most persuasive and successfully manipulative people to ever come along. I mean, so we have millions of people who are something like 30% of America for whom he can do no wrong. I mean, I think it really is, there's very little hyperbole in his statement that he could walk into Times Square and shoot someone and wouldn't lose a single vote. I mean, that is almost true.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah, and yet I find him to be the least persuasive, most transparently fraudulent person I can think of in public life. And I mean, this is true. This predates his run for the presidency by more than a decade. I mean, he's always appeared to me to be just a con artist and a crackpot and somebody who, wasn't nearly as wealthy as he was pretending to be, obviously not informed about 99% of the things you'd want to be informed about to hold this office. We have a reality TV star
Yeah.
running the country. And what's astonishing is his lying is so brazen. There's not even a pretense of it being calculated to deceive, right? Like his lies don't function the way normal lies do. And this is what has been so destructive of our public conversation. It's not like we have a president who tells lies that are so ingenious that they pass as truths. No, we have a president who tells lies that are obviously false and forces his surrogates and his opponents and everyone to just eat them.
Yeah. There's this great scene from Seinfeld that has made the rounds, I think, for the last number of months, that sort of crystallizes this point. And because one of the questions is, what does Donald Trump really think in his mind when he utters these things? And it's a scene in which I think George Costanza says to Jerry Seinfeld, just remember one thing. If you believe it, it's not a lie. And I don't know. I don't look.
Yeah.
Donald Trump says all these things. I mean, do you think Donald Trump, in every instance where he says things that are nonsense, doesn't believe them? If the twists and turns of his language and his rhetoric in interviews and with the press, and even in depositions long before he became president, indicate a very wacky way of thinking about what is a fact and what is not a fact. Not to excuse him in any way. I agree with you. I agree with you in everything you said.
I think the relevant concept here has been very helpfully defined by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt in his book On Bullshit. He actually wrote a very straight philosophical essay on the concept of bullshit. And the difference between a bullshitter and a liar is that a liar is actually having to reality test his utterances in an effort to get them to pass as truths. He understands the logical and empirical expectations of his audience, and he's trying to fit his lies carefully into the spaces they need to fit in order to have them pass as truths. Whereas a bullshitter is not spending any cognitive overhead trying to remember what's true or anticipate the logical expectations of his audience. He's just talking. There's no reality testing going on. He likes the sound of his own voice. He knows the message he wants to get across, and he's just confabulating and leaving the world to just react in his wake. And I mean, it is the most mystifying thing I have ever seen in my life, honestly. I mean, I don't know what I would rank as a possible second, that this has been this successful.
Right. So what's mystifying to you is not that there's a human being that has power who is attempting that, charade. What's mystifying is that it is successful, and there are a substantial number, numbering the tens and tens of millions, who either buy it or don't buy it and don't care.
I honestly don't know why this guy isn't homeless with the exact same head of hair begging for change. I mean, this is my sense that it says very little about his talents, and it says a lot about a kind of pathology in our society around fame and wealth or the perception of wealth
Well,
and the
can I
fact that he could
suggest?
leverage this.
Yeah, but can I
Uh,
suggest something else? And I think I agree with all that, but I think Donald Trump tapped into something, right? And there are people who are forgiving him or overlooking it. And I talk to people from time to time in passing, in the store, or you talk to someone who's driving the cab, and they will, and you wouldn't think based on the demographic that they would much like Donald Trump, and many of them don't. But every once in a while, someone says something that you know rings true, whether we like it or not. Donald Trump. I like to say Donald Trump was right about a few things. There is a swamp. There are a lot of forgotten people. The system is rigged. Those are three principles, observations. I mean, I don't think he's addressing them properly, and I think he's, to borrow the phrase we've been using a lot, full of shit, is bullshit. But that resonates with people, and there are a lot of folks in the country who were sick and tired of a different kind of bullshit, right? The bullshit that comes out of the mouths of these, well dressed, well coiffed politicians who just speak nonsense, and they don't say anything. They're never interesting. They say they're going to help you, and they're in Washington lining their own pockets too. They don't solve any problem. They don't balance any budget. They don't bring home any bacon, and people are sick of it. And just the status quo. And I don't blame those people for being sick of that. I think the better response is to have a candidate who, uh, you know, exudes authenticity and also truthfulness, and also some kind of modesty, humility, and care and empathy for people, and has a pragmatic sense. That's the better alternative. But you know what? In some universes, it's better to have a guy who speaks his mind and pisses everyone off, and doesn't look like the average politician who's blow dried and says the same nonsense every day and nothing changes. And a switch has gone off with some people. Like, you know what? That guy's my guy, because he may not be truthful. And this is a weird phrase, and I'm sure there are books that I haven't read on this that you can quote back to me. But he may not be truthful, but he's authentic, um, and that's how he gets away with it.
Again, I'm not even focusing narrowly on the fact that he is president. Another huge variable there is how bad a candidate Hillary Clinton was, and all of the grievances that are legitimate that you just mentioned that Trump managed to pander to. But the thing that is astonishing is that so many people who could argue that Trump was the better choice given the option and
Yeah,
given their
yeah,
concerns still find absolutely nothing to criticize in his behavior. He is bulletproof in this respect with his core fans, and it makes no sense. I mean, there's a kind of nihilism, and it's like as though it's perfectly fine to have a president tweeting threats of nuclear
right.
war. Like, why isn't that a good thing?
Yeah,
Whenever I, worry out loud about things like this, I'm attacked by Trumpkins as just being naive. He's just trolling, right? This is the new way you roll as president of the United States. You just troll people on
yeah.
Twitter.
They say, look, there are a lot of ways in which it's interesting. If it wasn't so serious, it would just be sort of an interesting, sideshow. Seeing how people who maybe once had intelligence and integrity of their own try to explain absurd things that come out of the mouth of the president, and among them are, right, don't take him literally, or he was joking. The president actually doesn't joke that much,
No.
but even they feel the need at some, on occasion, to give some explanation, to, I suppose, I don't know, the elites or others, as to why it's okay that the president said what he said. Look, and there are a lot of people, I'm on social media too, and I actually follow a lot, a number of people who are very, very, very supportive of Donald Trump, and remain so. And I look at the explanations that they give, and there's a certain kind of glee that people who hate traditional politicians get when people speak like you and I sometimes speak, and who get exercised over a lie told by Trump, or a transgression of some tradition or some point of etiquette.
Mhm.
There's a glee on the part of some people. Like, look at those people getting so upset because now we finally have a guy who calls it like it is, and is not like everyone else. I mean, I guess there's some value depending on how fed up people have become in having, their savior be somebody who is different. Sometimes difference is a virtue in and of itself. I don't think it overcomes all the other failings and vices, but that's one way of looking at it, I think.
The thing is, you could connect all those dots. You could have a totally unconventional and uncorruptible person in the office, somebody who's not beholden to special interests, somebody who can call bullshit on everything that is worth knocking over in Washington.
Yes.
But that person could actually be honest. That person could actually be informed. That person could actually be competent and not deranged by his own narcissism. The fact that those added variables are of no concern to his
Although,
supporters, that's what's
a person
so
like
shocking.
that you described, that sounds great, and I would love to see such a person. But part of the reason Trump is not destroyed every time some crazy thing happens, I mean, people credibly say, what would have happened to the kind of person you're talking, an honest, upstanding person, or someone who presented themselves that way? But I guess your hypothetical, as I'm saying it aloud, doesn't allow for my example. The reason why Donald Trump doesn't even have it it's not even on the front page of the paper, that his lawyer says he personally paid $130,000 to a porn star on the eve of the election with whom Donald Trump had an affair after he had just had a child with Melania, and that's not a big deal, is because Trump has defined deviancy down because of the whole rest of his personality.
Yeah.
It's what you see is what you get.
I've said this several times on the podcast that if he were 1/10 as bad, he would seem worse. He's just a fire hose of indiscretion, and you can't even pay attention to the last scandal because it's being replaced by a new one 2 hours later.
But the corollary to that, I think, is he is the way he is, and he does not present himself as a fountain of virtue, right? And a lot of politicians do. When people say, imagine what would happen if Barack Obama had, this thing happen to him or that thing happen to him. They're right that his presidency would crumble, but it wouldn't crumble. But they don't come to the American people as equals in their image. Barack Obama came forward, and I think he was an upright, good family person, has integrity. At least I don't see any evidence to the contrary. But he also presented himself as a kind of upstanding public figure. And so, any chink in that armor would have been far more devastating to him than, much, much larger scandals have been for Trump because of the way he's presented himself. Look, a smaller version of that is Bill Clinton. I don't think Bill Clinton ever presented himself as some kind of paragon of virtue either. And so in some ways, the hypocrisy that people don't like is lessened with someone like Donald Trump than it might be with somebody who is the ideal, platonic ideal that you're talking about, upstanding, virtuous, has the public's interest at heart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, Preet, I know your time has elapsed here. It's really been great to talk to you about this.
Yeah, this is great fun. Thank you, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
If you find the Waking Up podcast valuable, there are many ways you can support it. You can review it on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to listen to it. You can share it on social media with your friends. You can blog about it or discuss it on your own podcast. Or you can support it directly. And you can do this by subscribing through my website,